So I think that we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. I mentioned this earlier. It's really great to see some familiar faces at these events. I have so enjoyed seeing all of you over the past few months, and it's always sad when we don't have the opportunity to get to see one another again. So you've got your kind of usual clan of folks that are helping to keep the Zoom platform looking and feeling as best as we can, like being in a pub together. So Leah is here from Indiana Humanities, and she is letting folks in from the waiting room. And I hope, Leah, you'll be able to help me monitor the chat a little bit. I try to attend to questions, but I know I miss some. And then Rufus Cochran is also with us. Rufus is from Indiana Sciences, and he is doing our live stream. And then I also saw Jen from the Children's Museum, I think, is on tonight. Jen, thank you for being here, and from Central Indiana Science Outreach, which is another one of our great sponsors for these events. So thanks everybody again for being here. We're really excited to have you. Just as a reminder, if you're new to this great community, just a few sort of process points. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat for us. The place where you find the chat is located at the bottom of your screen, and it looks like a comic book word bubble. It says chat. It might be at the top, depending on how your toolbar is situated. But you can use the chat as a way just to kind of let us know if you have a question, or if you're having tech trouble. We'll try to help. I will be honest, I'm not a super tech guru on the on the Zoom. But yeah, we'll absolutely at least address your questions with Dr. Lau. And then the other option for you is that we have the kind of emoticon sort of reaction buttons, and those are available to you if you click participants at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a list of participants, and at the bottom you'll see yes, no, go slower, go faster. And so you're welcome to use those as well to give me some nonverbal feedback as we're walking through our conversation tonight. The way that this will work, just like a regular Books, Booze, Brains event, is we'll have Jen introduce herself and ask a few. I'll ask her a few questions and ask kind of her thoughts in the book, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. And as a reminder, those breakout rooms are sort of assigned randomly, so you get who you get, but we think that that's part of the fun of Books, Booze, Brains, right? It's just like sitting down at Upland. So we'll get started here, and when you get the breakout notice, I'll give you a few more instructions, but it's pretty simple to just move folks back and forth. And we'll do our best to kind of manage the platform, and I hope have a great conversation. All right, so with that, I am going to ask Jen to unmute herself, if you would, please, and say welcome. So happy to have you again. So our guest tonight is Dr. Jen Lau, who is a faculty member at Indiana University Bloomington. And as a reminder, tonight we read Eager, that has a really long subtitle that I actually didn't put on my notes. I think it's something like the surprise. I don't know if somebody has it in front of them. The surprisingly something life of beavers. I'm sure that Ben Goldfarb doesn't appreciate that I can't remember his whole title, but it was really fun. I don't know about all of you, but I thought it was a blast to read. And so, Jen, I would love to begin by just asking you if you would introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about kind of what you do and your kind of, I know that you don't have a personal relationship with beavers, but sort of how your work relates to beavers.
Sure. So I'm an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist, and I primarily study plants and how they interact with microbes and insects and other plants out there in the community, animals like deer that browse them. And I'm particularly interested in how plant populations respond to human-caused environmental changes. A lot like we heard in this book, habitat fragmentation, nitrogen addition, pollution, things like that. And I'm really interested both in how their interactions with other species change, but also how they might evolve differently because of what humans are doing to the environment. And so for years, I've taught Introduction to Ecology. And one of the classic, well, almost, I'd say, maybe 3 out of the 6 big topics in an Introduction to Ecology course show up in this book. And so beavers, for example, are like the classic ecosystem engineer, right? So I've talked about beavers in my courses for years, but I've never really, sat down and dug into them like this. Um, yeah, I thought it was a super fun book to read.
Yeah, I did too. It was one of those that I went in, I think all of us who organize Books, Booze, Brains come in with sort of varying levels of excitement about each of the books, right? Right. That's perfectly honest. And this is one that I was like, okay, I think it might be interesting. And I saw that it was nominated for the Penn Faulkner, and I was like, all right, I'm feeling a little more interested. And I said to Leah earlier that I can't tell you how many times as I was reading, I think of myself as a communication faculty member having pretty decent vocabulary, but how frequently I hit that dictionary button to look up a word. And I think that it's just a testament to some of the beautiful writing that kind of comes along with not just kind of Goldfarb's sort of experience with beavers, but also the way that he interacts with the others, the others in the book. I enjoyed that part a lot.
I know, like almost every page there was a word I didn't know, and I like to pretend I have a good vocabulary.
Right.
And
It was pretty fun.
my kid's teacher has the rule, where if he's reading a book and he counts on his fingers how many words he doesn't know, and if he hits 5, then the book's too hard. And this book might have been too hard for me.
That's a funny one. I like it. So I thought that we'd try something new to start off our conversation tonight. We didn't do this last time, but we've got the Zoom technology. I know that many of you who've attended these events before, I love a little poker chip question. So I set up a poll for us, which you should be able to use, I think, on just about any device that you're on. So I'll open the poll, and the poll is actually a question that Ben Goldfarb asked a group of folks who were reading this book in a book club themselves. So I'll open the poll and I'll ask you to answer. So the question is, now that you've read the book, or maybe not, no judgment, what are your feelings about beavers? Your choices are primarily positive, primarily negative, or somewhere in between. So I think you can see the poll. If you can't see the poll, no worries. Just throw it in the chat box and kind of let us know what you think. Um, One of the things that Goldfarb talks about in this book is that sort of being the beaver believer, right? That's that person that just is kind of learns more about beavers and then comes to that place of really connecting the broader ecological system to the experiences of beavers. So I'll go ahead and stop the poll and show you how you responded. Most everyone was positive. There was a somewhere in between person, and I have to be honest that I that was one of the things that I thought about as I was reading this. So I prep for these, right? And one of the things I often do is read the Goodreads reviews. And there was someone who posted a Goodreads review that was essentially chapter 1, why beavers are awesome. Chapter 2, why beavers are awesome. Chapter 3, maybe not as much as we thought, but probably. Chapter 4, why beavers are awesome. And I thought that actually was a pretty accurate review in a lot of ways. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that by the end of this book, Goldfarb is pretty on board with the being a beaver believer, or a believer, as Terrafor said. So I want to start with or Jen, I guess I should ask you before I kind of jump into our first turn and talk. Did this book change any I know you said you've talked about beavers in your classes before. Did it change any of your perspectives about beavers?
I don't think it changed how much I value beavers. But I think what it did change was it made me think about how unnatural our natural history is. So I was just at a conference earlier this year, and we had this debate, and it was about, can you study natural history now, right? Now that humans have such a big effect. And one side was arguing yes, and one side was arguing no. And I came down solidly like, yes, we can still still study natural history. And this book made me really wonder, can we? And if Grinnell, one of the giants in ecology, got it wrong, you know, yeah. So I think it changed my views, not about beavers, but maybe about the way we study ecology.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that is really powerful about the book. If you kind of dig a little deeply into it, and I have some kind of philosophical questions, turn and talk questions for us a little bit later tonight. When I was a graduate student, I took a class about narrative that was all about sort of narrative and storytelling and how that shapes the way we think. And there was this amazing book that we read that's very much an academic book, so don't go out and get it because it's probably not exciting to anybody but me, but it's called Narrative Memory Community. And it was about sort of thinking about how stories that we all tell, that we all agree upon, are kind of shaped by others. And one of the chapters focused on the way in which the narrative of evolution has changed over time. And I think that that's one of the pieces to me that this book is sort of pushing us toward, is thinking about how our narratives of evolution may adapt, or how we might choose to adapt them, is probably saying that better, as we think about things like the climate crisis. All right. Jen, any thoughts before we head into our first turn and talk?
No, I think the the one being that it has changed my opinion of are 4 and 8-year-old boys by these 2 kids, and they're forever playing in the creeks and building dams. And for a long time, we used to make them knock them down at the end. But now I'm totally rethinking that. We don't have beavers here anymore. Maybe that's like the 4 and 8-year-old boy job.
Right. Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. All right. So here's our first small group question. So, as I read this book and thought about kind of what the goals of the book are, and it went from chapter to chapter, I think that this book is really about seeing our landscapes differently. Every person that Goldfarb encountered in writing this book sort of saw something slightly differently. And I think that understanding what our landscapes used to look like and what they look like now, how man's role has shaped the way that landscapes have developed over time, obviously, which is something that Dr. Lau mentioned. Even if you think about something like the fur trade that we think we have a pretty clear history of, right? That this book sort of questions a lot of that. So my question for you is, what do you think it takes for humans to see the landscape differently? So kind of thinking about this book, or even if you didn't have time to read the book, what do you think it takes for humans to see the landscape differently? And I will go ahead and open up breakout rooms, and we'll put you into breakout rooms, and we'll give you a few minutes to talk, and then we'll ask you to come back to the main room, and we'll reflect with Jen and reflect with the rest of the groups. So I'm going to mute myself and put you into breakout rooms. Just a reminder, as you head into your rooms, you are welcome to unmute yourself when you get there.
Okay. Sorry about that. It popped up and I just left. You're muted, I think, Krista.
Thank you. I
Yep.
appreciate that. It's automatically assigns you to a breakout room. So that's how you kind of ended up there. And Glenn and Nam, do you want to be assigned to a breakout room? Did you guys not make the assignments, or do you want to hang out in the main room with us? It's totally up to you. Give me a chat if you'd like to move, or if you want to hang out here, you're welcome to. All right, sounds good. So, Jen, what do you think about? I imagine this is something you sort of try to teach your students in the Intro to Ecology course, right? Is like, how do you kind of hit the reset button on your ability to see the world?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really hard thing to do. And I think, when I think back over my career, there are things, yeah, my perceptions have changed, even though I've been studying biology for 25 years and ecology for 25 years. I think, yeah, my perceptions continue to change. And, I think part of that is that's my job, right? My job is
Sure.
to observe and learn from what I'm seeing, but I don't know how you teach people to do that or how you encourage people to do that. And so I'd love to be listening in on some of the breakout rooms to hear what non-scientists are saying about how they think about the natural world.
Well, the other thing I think about, so as I was writing questions tonight, this is one of the things I was kind of thinking deeply about, right? I try to ask my students to do that in my nonverbal communication class, to like really tune in to what do people say when they're not saying anything because they're still talking, right?
Yeah.
Um, and some of it I think is just someone asking you to, right? There's like a little disruptive event that might kind of shape that. Um, and so I wonder, I'll just ask you, can you think of a time, like you were saying that your perspective has changed over your career. What have been like those turning points or those moments where you've been like, I might be seeing this differently now?
Yeah. I mean, I can think of very specific examples. That are hard to translate. Where so I study evolution. One of the things I do is I measure natural selection. So it sounds crazy, but you can go out into the wild and you can measure the strength of natural selection and use it to predict how populations will evolve. And I was taught how to do this in grad school, and I really thought I knew how to do it well. And then along comes a new paper that kind of points out how many of us were doing it wrong, right? Or how pretty much the entire field was doing it wrong. And it was a data analysis issue, and but it those types of things really kind of change. Like I thought I knew how to do something, and
Hmm.
now that's not right. And how do we move forward, and how does it change what I thought I knew? And it's kind of different, right? That's not about seeing landscapes. It's how we do our science. But I feel like it's in some ways it's similar.
And I think that one of the other things that's powerful about this is, as I was writing these questions and sort of thinking about it, is how many different fields are actually trained to see, like, is I had a bunch of existential questions, like, is discipline actually, like, the idea of discipline, the idea of where you work, what field you're in, is that really just about ways of seeing the world?
mm,
Right? So, like, you see the world differently than I see the
yeah,
world, and in part, we're trained to see the world in a particular way, right? Like,
right,
that's our job. And, I think about, like, my mom has a child development degree, and the things that she notices that children do, I'm just like, "Oh, that's just a kid being crazy." And she's like, "No,
yeah,
actually, what's happening is really important work there." And I like, it was really powerful, at least for me, as I was reading this, to think about, like, how do you teach particularly like undergraduate students, for example, to kind of rethink, because that's what that whole education process is
right,
rethinking how you see the world.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's not just about how they see landscapes, right? It's about how they see
Right.
everything. And yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think for me personally, it's always been about experiences, right? I mean, I was raised with a particular set of values, but then you go out into the wider world, and you reevaluate those values. And um yeah, so I don't know. I mean, for me personally, I think it's all about those experiences. And then maybe it's the same thing with teaching, right? Giving students those experiences and opportunities, to
Right.
question what they thought they knew, whether
Right.
it's about the way landscapes work or not.
Well,
um
and I love this. A lot of what I think Goldfarb talks about in this book is just, some of the choices that we make in seeing things differently, right?
yeah,
Like, so the moments that, you kind of hear the folks that view the beavers as a pest versus an asset,
hmm,
and how those views have potentially changed a little bit over time, but maybe not really.
hmm,
And so thinking about, I think, those, to me, those turning points, those places are really interesting to kind of dig into.
Yeah. I love the part, where it was the rancher calling up his, or, who said he had to call up his dad
Yeah.
and tell him about, going after the beaver. It, you know, yeah. There's a couple other really great examples. Like they talk about the wolves of Yellowstone in this book too, right? But
Yeah,
that's
right.
another classic story of people seeing the same thing but from really different perspectives, and how do you bring those two worlds together? And there's this fantastic PBS series all about predators where they talk about the wolves of Yellowstone. And in that one, they have a Forest Service worker who's talking about, the best day in his life was when a rancher was calling him up to say, "Hey, tell me where those radio collared wolves are." Not because he wanted to go out and hunt them, but because it told him where to take his sheep and
Yeah.
and his livestock. And yeah, but I think that's hard to do. I mean, I don't do a ton of interdisciplinary work, but I do collaborate with social scientists, and just figuring out how to talk about the same issue and come together to, solve a problem. That's the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that one of the things I think that is a barrier to sort of taking on others' perspectives or to see things differently, right? Like to kind of Goldfarb's perspective of seeing things differently, is that sometimes we don't even have the vocabulary that we need to be able to describe what we're seeing,
Yeah.
right? Like we don't even have the words to explain it. We just know that this is different than it used to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Like, so the ability to communicate, right? And,
Hmm.
and kind of reach across those boundaries. But also maybe the empathy to see that, not everybody shares your worldview. And
Yeah,
as a scientist, that's really hard for me, right? Because I mean, I think it's fact, like, oh, this is the way it is. But
yeah.
that's not true. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to call everybody back here and they'll have a minute to come back. And then I'll ask you, even though it's a little bit repetitive, to kind of rehash some of the things we talked about, as well as get some perspectives from the rest of the groups.
Sure.
Welcome back, everybody. We're moving everybody back here in just a few seconds. Give us a minute. Welcome back, folks. Give us a minute and we will head on back to our general conversation. James, it's good to see you. Didn't see you earlier. All right, looks like folks are coming back. That's excellent. Hope that y'all had some great conversations in your rooms, in your breakout rooms. I think that there was one room that maybe was a little under attended, so I'll make sure to redistribute you if you didn't have enough folks in your breakout room. So Jen and I had a great conversation while you were gone for all the folks on the live stream, and just like with our face-to-face events, we'll reshare a little bit of that with all of you. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a chance to share kind of how your conversations went in your breakout rooms. If there was anything really salient, or if maybe one of your team members in the breakout room offered kind of an interesting idea or perspective. So the question again for those who may have joined a little bit late were was just kind of me thinking about the idea that that this book is really about kind of seeing our landscapes differently, understanding what they used to look like and what they look like now, how man's role has shaped the way that landscapes have developed. And my question for all of you is, what does it take for humans to see the landscape differently? So I would love it to hear kind of some of your conversations. And I think that the easiest thing to do might be to raise your hand. And so you can raise your hand either by using the reaction button at the bottom or using the raise your hand button underneath participants. So if you had kind of an interesting part of your conversation that you think is worth sharing, that response to how do humans see landscapes differently, go ahead and give us a little thumbs up at that bottom reaction button, and I'll call on you and we can unmute you. Any thoughts? Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, so our group kind of talked mostly about how we're very reactive when seeing the landscape. So usually it takes either a big disaster or a loss in money or something like that for, unfortunately, for us to see the landscape. And we also touched a bit about how part of that is because people don't interact with the landscape a lot. So for instance, it's very difficult for, we were talking about like inner city schools, you know, introducing kids to a natural landscape because the only landscape they've ever known is the concrete one. So how do you introduce them to the landscape and see the landscape, and also kind of explain the complexity of the landscape? Because I know that was another big topic in the book, is thinking that you're helping the landscape but not realizing how interconnected everything is, and actually what you're doing to help actually was harmful.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys had a really good conversation. I agree that the level of complexity that I felt like so many times he would answer his own question was sort of, it depends, right? And I think that's one of the things that really comes through, is that there are likely many things that we don't know about about how the landscape is affected by us and by other species. So that's a great idea. Other kind of thoughts from your small groups about how this conversation went about that question of seeing the landscape differently? Dave, go ahead.
What somebody mentioned was that the way the urbanization and the land uses has changed the species that we see a lot, because when I was a kid, there didn't appear to be any beavers and so forth, and or raptors, or a lot of other species. And so your idea of what the baseline is has changed over time.
That's a great point, right? The idea that we know that the human perception process is flawed. The example that I use in my undergraduate class is the idea that when you start to look for a car because you know you need a new car, you look around and it seems like every car is for sale, right? And it's not that every car is for sale, right? You all know that, right? It's that we are filling in those gaps in ways that we haven't before. And so I think that really shapes kind of how do you attend to all of the stimuli around you, and how can you kind of be trained to see differently. Jen and I had kind of an interesting conversation about sort of like how we are trained as scientists or as social scientists to see the world differently. So Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about what some of the experiences were that you had that sort of shaped the way that you see the world?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think the first thing we talked about was that as scientists, we're kind of trained to continually reevaluate. So we think we know something, and then it turns out it was all wrong. And how do we go from there? So I think, so we're trained to be somewhat flexible and responsive, but even then it's still hard. And I think for me personally, it's recognizing, that my views of the landscape can change, but also that others have very different impressions and very different views of the same thing that I might be seeing, right? And it's affected by their values. And where I look out and I see, my weedy lawn, and I think this is amazing, and my neighbors might not agree. And yeah. So I think the challenge is how to maintain that flexibility, right? How can we go out there and continue to learn and kind of modify our values as we know more?
Absolutely. And some of that does come from those precipitating events, right? Like that there's kind of that something that happens. And so you were talking about before we kind of left for break, like just even the way that you collect data was changed by sort of a new innovation. Do you want to talk about that with the group?
Yeah, I mean, so the whole reason why I'm a biologist is I was a math major and I took an evolution class, and the professor taught us that you could actually go out into nature, measure traits about a species, measure how much they reproduced, how well they survived, and be able to predict how that population would evolve in the future. And that totally blew my mind. And so there are these basically statistical techniques that we use to predict evolution in the wild. And I had learned them in grad school and had been using them for a number of years. And then, eventually new papers start coming out about how should we be treating our data? How should we be manipulating our data before we analyze it? And that, it didn't change in principle what we were doing, but it had to change how we were doing it. And so then, I mean, stuff like that happens in science all the time. And it causes you to kind of think back and reevaluate, okay, I thought I knew this, how well did I really know it?
So while y'all were in your breakout rooms, this is what I think led Jen and I to get a little bit deep into the idea that maybe that's what education is in the first place, is teaching you to see something differently, right? The idea that Jen as a scientist looks at things differently than I do as a social scientist, right? That we see different things because that's what we're trained to do. And what would it look like to retrain all of our young people to sort of see the world differently? We even talked about the idea that to some extent the idea that the vocabulary that we use shapes our perception, right? So talking about something like global warming versus climate change, that can shape the way that we see the world. So I think that those are really powerful concepts. Go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, or even like, I mean, a lot of the big problems, right? Like the problems that Goldfarb talks about in this book, like they require many disciplines. So how does somebody like Krista and somebody like me, come together to figure out those solutions? And with such different views and, the way we see the world, it just differs. I think
I think that's, and I think it's challenging and also exciting, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we know that, nobody is going to, solve the climate crisis or cure cancer by themselves in a room, right? That it's going to be lots of folks together from sort of different perspectives solving these really big problems. So I want to give Jen a question, and as usual, I like to choose some passages from the book that made me think a little bit more deeply and ask Jen to react to those. So the first passage that I chose that I think is kind of interesting is it's actually in chapter 2, and I'll bounce around tonight in part because this was just how I felt like the questions fit together. So this is on page 55, and it is about the concept of the keystone species. So the quote is, add up all those dependents and you begin to comprehend why scientists consider beavers the ultimate keystone species. To architects, a keystone is the wedge-shaped block that forms the apex of the stone arch, the brick that holds the span in place. To ecologists, a keystone species is that rare organism that likewise supports an entire biological community. Salmon whose decomposing carcasses sustain grizzly bears, eagles, and even trees are one keystone species. Elephants who clear out the savanna for grasses by uprooting trees and shrubs are another. Pull that keystone out and the arch or the ecosystem collapses. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit, Jen, kind of based on your experience, how this concept works and then how humans can get in the way of it.
Sure. So keystone species are one of the big terms in ecology. It's one of the most famous phrases, I'd say, and it was coined by this ecologist working off the coast of Washington State back in the 60s, a guy named Bob Payne. And like that passage described, it's basically a species that has a really big impact on other organisms in the environment. So oftentimes these are good impacts, like increasing diversity, so increasing the number of other types of species that can occur in this area. And it's all about kind of like the pound for pound impact. So a lot of species have a big effect, not because we consider them a keystone species, but because they're so numerous or so abundant. We call them dominant species, right? So like the willows and the aspens in this book. Those are dominant species. They have a big effect. They're really important to the community, but they're important because they're so abundant. And, you know, it's the major food resource. Other species.
I'm sorry, Jen,
Yeah,
just to
go ahead.
interrupt you really quickly. Leah asked if maybe you could offer an example. Like, do we have some keystone species here in Indiana that could be worth mentioning?
Well, you know, so I think the lack of keystone species is probably more notable than their presence here. So wolves would have been a keystone species, you know, in Indiana. And you can tell they were important because I'm assuming Indianapolis is like Bloomington, and you look outside and there are herds of deer walking down the street, maybe, in some of the suburbs at least. You know, so deer are overpopulated. And why? Because we're lacking that key predator that was able to keep them in check.
That's a great example. Thanks.
Just like the wolves in Yellowstone that he talks about later in the book. There's many other examples. So, you know, Bob Payne, he coined this term from his studies of starfish in the rocky intertidal. So if any of you have been out west, there, you know, it's a really rugged coastline, these rocky outcrops. And if you look at the species inhabiting that really harsh environment, it's things like mussels and limpets. So you know, these animals that hang on tight to that rocky interface. And the keystone predator out there is starfish. And so they'll come out of the ocean and will predate. They'll eat the most dominant, the best competitor there. And by eating that best competitor, they allow other species to persist. They don't get outcompeted by that dominant competitor. So in areas where there's lots of starfish, you see many more species than in areas where you don't have these starfish. You know, anything can be a keystone species if it's important enough. In some of my work, we argue that rhizobia, which are these little, you know, microscopic nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in the soil, you know, we argue that they're keystone species because in some systems they can increase plant diversity. It's kind of funny because before reading this book, I wouldn't have highlighted beavers as an example of a keystone species. Instead, I would have called them ecosystem engineers, which I think he also uses in this book, but which refers to an organism or a species that modifies its environment to a great extent. And you know, oftentimes they go hand in hand. By modifying the environment, they can create that habitat for many more species.
We have a great question from Shauna in the chat that I would love to hear your perspective on before we head into our next turn and talk. And her question is, what about humans? Are humans considered a keystone species? Are they just a dominant species or both? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I mean, we are certainly super abundant, right? So in Indianapolis, I would say humans are a dominant species. In the ranches out west, you know, human population densities are much lower, but we're still having a huge impact on the environment. So there, you know, we're a keystone species. Not in the good sense though, right? We typically aren't increasing biodiversity.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, that one of the sort of aspects that he talks about is that notion of biodiversity and how keystone species have a really key, no pun intended, you know, sort of role in that process. So one of the things that I think was interesting to me as I was reading about the keystone species is that it drew me to my next question, which was really about sort of the relationship between practice and science, right? So, you know, species that we thought were keystone species, you know, that we thought necessarily had a role, maybe didn't have a role, right? So Jen and I, before, when you guys came back from the breakouts, we were talking about the wolves of Yellowstone, which were kind of featured prominently in the book. So the next question that I have is a turn and talk question that's focused on how we understand science. And so the quote that got me thinking is in chapter 4 on page 96 of the edition that I'm reading. And I'll read you the quote. It's a little bit long, but I think it's a good one. We might put a lot of hope and capital and trust in the idea that a project is going to work. But if we don't have the right context, we're setting ourselves up for failure in other places. Carolyn Nash, a PhD candidate at Oregon State, told me. Nash is a member of a Beaver study team whose emphasis is expectation management. In 2017, the group published a broad examination of beaver restoration on Western rangelands that found, as she put it to me, that, quote, practice is moving a lot faster than the pace of science. At least 76 separate projects are currently moving beavers around the West, yet only 4 monitor the results for longer than 5 years. Whether the rampant relocations are muddling genetics or transmitting diseases between colonies remains something of an unknown. So I was thinking about that and thinking about this time that we are living in, right? That all of us are in this sort of COVID-19 crisis, and the extent to which practice sometimes outpaces the science, right? That there's this one situation where something works, and so we try to replicate it, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And so my question for you is, why do you think it is that sometimes practice moves faster than science? So that's our question for the next breakout, which is, why sometimes does practice move faster than science in the case of moving beavers or potentially COVID or other scenarios in general? So I'll put you in your breakout rooms again, and then for that breakout that might have had fewer folks in them in there, I'll try to move the new folks in there so you have more folks to talk to. And Jen and I will stay here. All right. So Rachel, I noticed that you're not in your breakout room. If you want to stay here in the main room, you can, but if not, I moved you to breakout room 3. If you'd like to have a turn and talk conversation with some folks, you're welcome to do that. And I will just make sure everybody's doing okay in their breakouts here. Looks like everybody's there. All right. So let's see. So Jen, my question about this one is about kind of, I think some like half scientific process, half human nature, maybe? I'm not really sure. I couldn't answer this question on my own, but I did think about it a bit.
You know, that's funny that you say that, because that's exactly how I just divided up my answer. So, you know, I think there's a few pragmatic reasons why, you know, practice sometimes moves faster than science. And I think, you know, the number one reason is we want a solution, right? And we want an immediate solution, and we want to be doing something right now. And you mentioned relating it to the current crisis, right? And we hear that all the time, right? You know, let's speed up the process of developing a vaccine or a treatment. But
Right.
that's not the way science works, right? You know, it takes time. And then I was thinking, as you read the question, I was thinking more about, you know, the specifics that they highlight here, you know, that only 4 monitor the results for longer than 5 years. You know, pragmatically, that's how we fund science. You know, so most science is funded by government agencies, you know, some nonprofits, some, you know, sometimes industry, but they're almost always 3 to 5 year grants. And it's really hard to get funded for longer term science. And there are some really great programs, some out of the National Science Foundation, that are designed to fill that gap, right? And help us answer questions that take longer than that typical 3 to 5 year grant funding cycle.
Sure.
But, you know, I think that kind of limits how we answer some of these questions.
Yeah, I think that this was one of the things that was really hard for me as I was reading this book, right? Is that this is going to make, as a social scientist, I understand how the process works. This is going to make me sound like I am discounting the scientific process, but to some extent, it's really informed trial and error.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is really well informed. You document everything you do, but you're still trying something to see what results you get. And you know, you hope that you're, you know, pretending, you know, depending on the hypothesis, you might hope that that's confirmed, but there's a risk involved every time.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of my early grad students was a guy who had spent 10 years as a restoration ecologist. So on the ground, restoring prairies across Southwest Michigan. And the reason why he wanted to come to grad school was because he would do exactly what you described, right? He would try a different approach on this prairie over here and a different one over here, and sometimes they worked and sometimes he didn't. And he wanted to learn how to do that right? How to put it in a predictive framework and actually be able to predict when something would work. And and this quote in particular made me think a lot about restoration ecology in general. So this book's more about, conservation, protecting,
Sure.
although relocating too. But restoration ecology is about rebuilding those habitats that we've destroyed. And it's the exact same thing there, right? I mean, the practice is going much faster than the science. Um, I think it might also be in part because of the scales, the spatial scales. Like these are really big problems, right? They occur across watersheds, and our experiments, or the first experiments we do are much smaller in scale. And so to figure out, how those results scale up to these bigger scales is another challenge.
It's a challenge, and like it's a temporal challenge as well as an intellectual challenge,
That's right.
right? Like
Yeah.
simply moving people and equipment from place to place, that there's like a sort of time and space thing that you can't get past if you're talking about moving beavers around. I'll show the parachuting beaver clip here in a minute. But there is that sort of like, how do I do this quickly? I always think about, whenever I'm talking about these things, I think about the research that we do at the IU School of Medicine on some of our medical education techniques. And we have the largest medical student class in the country. Like it takes forever for me to implement an innovation at IU.
Yeah.
But my colleagues, I work really closely with a colleague at Rutgers who has just under 100 medical students per class. She can implement them like that. And so very frequently what we'll do is collaborate on a project. She implements it, gets the data, and then I can implement it at a larger scale.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I think that same, just kind of hearing you talk about this, I think that same problem to some extent, it exists, right? If you're working in Yellowstone or a space like Yellowstone,
Mhm.
there's only so much actual space you can cover.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really, I just think it's really interesting to think about how the kind of, and well, I guess that's a question for you. Like, to what extent does the practice of this work inform the scientific conversation?
Ooh. That it certainly does, and increasingly so. Um, but I'd say as scientists, that's one thing we still aren't great at. Um, and we're trying to get better. The federal agencies are trying to make us get better by putting in place, like one of the new buzzwords is convergent science or transdisciplinary research, right? Which
Sure.
kind of brings in those outside stakeholders to tell scientists what they need and what they know, and helping it inform, new hypotheses, new theories, new experiments.
Yeah.
That's
And it
hard.
makes you question, like, how does expertise move, right?
Mhm.
Does it move kind of from the university space, or, from the lab space into communities, or do communities have something to sort of bring to that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most restoration practitioners, you know, know much more about restoration ecology than someone who's trained as a basic ecologist like me. Same
Yeah,
thing like, farmers, they have so much, hands-on and traditional knowledge,
sure.
that comes from a different place, but and might not be organized the same way that I would think about it, but is probably much more expansive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful example. I'm going to call everybody back and we'll talk about some of these again with the rest of the group. And for Kim and Estoli, if you would like to join a breakout room and have not yet, you can welcome to stick around. And then for the next breakout, we'll bounce you into a breakout room. We're happy to have you. All right, folks will have a minute to come back and then we'll chat some more. Yeah, I was thinking about, I have been doing some work lately on how patients and the experiences of patients actually and can inform the biomedical research agenda. Kind of thinking about, like, if you are an MD, PhD, or a clinical scientist and you see patients regularly and you have patients that give you data, or information that then inform your research, what does that make the expertise loop look like?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably the way more science should be done.
But I think it's hard. I mean, science is like any other industry, right? And so, my friend who I've been writing about this concept with is a person living with a brain tumor. He's also a philosopher of science. And he gets invited to conferences, and, his ability to be able to contribute to the conversation sometimes is relatively limited. And I think that goes back to that vocabulary piece, right? Like if you just don't have the vocabulary, the discipline, it's hard.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you all. I hope that you had interesting conversations. Jen and I, per the usual, had lots of really fun conversation around this quote on chapter, in chapter 4, page 96, if you want to take a look. And the quote ends just as a reminder, whether the rampant relocations are muddling genetics or transmitting diseases between colonies remains something of an unknown. And that example that he gives is really focused on the extent to which practice is or isn't informing science. And so my question for all of you is, why sometimes does practice move faster than science? So I would love to have you kind of raise your hand or use the thumbs up to let me know if you had kind of an interesting conversation or someone's voice that you'd like to amplify on this question. Why does practice sometimes move faster than science? I think I see a hand there. I can't see your name, so go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I think I'm unmuted. Okay. We talked about how with a lot of science, people are impatient. And especially when you're dealing with government funding or state funding where people have to say, right, we're putting our money for this, we need to see an outcome, that they just want you to do it. Like, you can't tell them, oh, we have no idea what's going to happen, we'll have to see 5 years. They don't want to hear that, right? You've got to show them results, you've got to do something. And for some of these folks, what they might be doing is kind of like throwing in the gauntlet and be like, okay, we'd really like to do the science, but we've done a small win by even letting them go in. Maybe we can write a small grant or something to look at this later. But it's really, really hard no matter what field you're in. I'm sure anybody who's in sciences who has to get funding can agree with me with this. But they don't want to hear, like, we don't know. That's one thing they don't want to hear in a funding body. And they also don't want to hear, well, we won't know until X years down the line. They want to know now.
That's a great point, Jen. And kind of seeing some of the very long-term, I was going to say downstream, I feel like this book is just a recipe for a lot of really bad puns. I'm just saying that out loud. So some of the downstream effects are really long-term, right? And I think that is one of the things that's really challenging about this. And then the funding climate, to your point, that was something that Jen and I talked about as well. So Nam, I noticed that you had your hand up kind of during the last round. Go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
Thank you. I would almost kind of separate the practice and the science a little bit. I view practice as a tradition that, for example, like that farmers have been carrying out for generations in trying to exterminate wolves or coyotes. I don't know exactly what sort of campaign needs to be brought out or kind of rolled out to counteract that. If it's a better PR campaign by Big Beaver or whatever, we established in 1995 as wolves are reintroduced. That's a pretty unmitigated success story. Can beavers kind of ride those coattails? As for the science aspect, I'm curious. Is there a larger issue with, I'm going to group all sciences, and I'm interested in as a social scientist and a biologist, both in a time of sort of anti-science or anti-intellectualism, what sort of similar PR campaign science needs to undergo to combat bad science, most notably like, phrenology or Tuskegee experiments with I think a lot of people kind of group all that together. Your thoughts?
Yeah, Jen, go ahead and tell me kind of, I think that Nam raises some really good points there, that there are sometimes when non-experts get involved, particularly in something like science, we see some of the outcomes of that, right? Some of the really negative outcomes of that. And so I think thinking about kind of what is the expertise that exists, now I'm use the example of farmers. There's some great work in expertise studies that talks about things like the multi-generation sheep farmers at the Chernobyl disaster site, right? They were seeing genetic changes in their sheep before scientists were actually seeing those genetic changes. And so thinking about kind of how does that the science and expertise studies literature calls it sort of craft expertise. How does that craft expertise inform the way that we think about the scientific endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, so this is related to something that Krista and I were talking a little bit about too, about kind of there's a lot of buzzwords, but transdisciplinary science or convergent science, the idea of, tapping into that knowledge that Krista was talking about, right? So maybe not trained scientists, but the farmer who has been, working in his fields his entire life has a lot of knowledge about, about climate change and how that's affecting his crops and things like that. But then, translating it into science, it's challenging because we as scientists aren't trained to, we're not great at talking to non-scientists. And so we're trying to do better. We're trying to train the next generation of scientists to be able to take advantage of that other types of knowledge much better than my generation was, but it's a slow process. And then you also brought up the point about kind of general distrust in science. And for me, I think it's really about training the general public, and ideally starting at younger ages, what science is, how it's done, how data is interpreted. Because I agree. I mean, there are some very bad cases of bad science, right? But if you understand how science is done, sometimes those are hard to pick out. But you can I feel like you can at least appreciate what data is, what goes into collecting it, and how science can help you come up with answers. But that's also a long-term process, right? That's not a 5-year solution.
Well, and I think that the practice piece, so Leah's group made kind of an interesting comment related to that. She said, we talked about the understandable desire to be helpful, even if it might be dumb or short-sighted, right? And I think that that's one of the things that's hard in these contexts, is that if the immediate problem seems to be the beaver, right? in lots of these cases, and you understand how folks get there. And I think that Goldfarb actually does a pretty good job of kind of creating empathy for folks who are experiencing incredible financial hardship and other hardships because of what was for many years kind of seen as a pest. You talked a little bit, though, as we kind of think about the scientific process, of the idea that people want a solution, right? That there's that piece of like, you just want a solution fast, and so you keep trying things until they work.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, and we can see that here now, right? Everybody wants a vaccine for COVID. Everybody wants a new treatment that works. But those trials, those good trials, take time, right? So the early trials show one thing, and not statistically significant, not supported, not a good scientific study, and yet it can kind of lead us in a direction, or lead us towards a belief that it takes a lot to undo. In restoration ecology, we see the same thing. There's just a lot of beliefs that make sense, right, about how we should restore the world or how we should conserve things. But yeah, they aren't tested. And they're treated as fact, and it can even be hard to publish findings that go against those.
And I think, kind of to your point, Jen, you were talking about your graduate student, right, who kind of came to the space of this work thinking like, I want to be able to know what the right solution is. And as a practitioner, I try things, they work. Can you talk about kind of what happens, or the experience of transitioning from practitioner to scientist, or a practitioner, so she's still scientist, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I was telling Krista about one of my former graduate students who was a restoration manager or a restoration practitioner for a number of years. So he was the boots on the ground guy who was going out and installing prairie restorations all over Southwest Michigan. And over that decade that he was doing this, he realized that some of his restorations were really successful. They would grow up to look like, like a native prairie was supposed to look. And other of his restorations, were weed fields and not the species they wanted to be there, very low diversity sites. And his entire motivation for coming to graduate school was to figure out why. Why would he do something in this one area and it would work, but he might try the same exact thing over here and it wouldn't. And and it's, I think, he loved graduate school because he was the type of guy who I mean, he was a scientist before he became an official scientist, right? Or before he got his PhD. He was the person out there asking questions. And he may not have been setting up rigorous experiments and analyzing the data from those experiments, but in his head, that's essentially what he was doing, right? Keeping track of where things worked and where things didn't. And I think that's true for a lot of people, a lot of conservationists, whether they're beaver acolytes with very informal training or farmers farming their fields year after year, that kind of, yeah, they're collecting data too.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point, that when we think about kind of the scientific process, that process is not just available to scientists, right? And that doesn't mean that specialized knowledge is certainly a part of many years of study, but the process by which we do good science and test hypotheses, that's work that's available to many of us. And I think that one of the things that's been interesting as I've listened to you talk, Jen, is some of the back channel around the conversation about success versus failure. So, I think that that's one of those things that can be really challenging. So Jen mentioned the idea that negative results don't get published, right? So your failure, it's only the successes that get published, not the failures. And in a lot of ways, the failures are what inform how you make decisions moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know. I think that's probably the biggest problem facing science right now, is it's really hard, to come up with general conclusions about the way the world works if we're only getting half the story, right? If we're only getting those, the significant results that show something matter. What about all the times it doesn't matter? And that, it's really common in ecology. Like, the theme of this book, Krista already mentioned it once, is it depends. What you do in one environment will have a very different outcome than what you do in a different environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I've got a little activity for us that I want to try that sort of relates to this. One of the kind of failed experiments, but not entirely failed experiments in this book was also, in my estimation, one of the funniest moments in the book. And that was thinking about the paratrooper beavers. So if you didn't have a chance to read the book, the state of Idaho at one point was trying to move some beavers around, and they opted to attach some parachutes to some beavers and develop this really complicated box so that when the beaver landed, they could get out of the box into their new home. And Ohio Public Radio and Public Television, thanks y'all, shared this video on YouTube. So I thought that we could watch a few minutes of it and watch some of the Beaver Paratroopers, and then talk about some of the incredible lengths that scientists go to do their science. So I'm gonna thanks Zoom, right? The power of Zoom. I can show the example to y'all. So I think I can share my screen and give you an opportunity to watch the video here. All right, so here we go. We're gonna watch some Beaver Paratroopers. And if you can hear this sound, just give me a thumbs up so I know you can hear it. Sounds like no sound. Let me try one more time.
The drop crates are loaded into the airplane. Parachutes are attached to cargo lines, and the boxes are stacked in rows along the waist of the plane. 10 boxes to a load, 20 beaver ready for the flight to mountain meadows. The plane makes a careful approach, ready for the drop. Now into the air and down they swing, down to the ground near a stream or a lake. The box opens and a most unusual and novel trip ends for Mr. Beaver. He's on his way now. His nose and his instinct tell him where to find the water. There's room here for a new home.
Shauna says that she recognizes this dude's voice from her grade school movies, right? There's a great I think it's from Wired, that talks about why everyone's announcer voice at that time sounded the same. It's about the microphones at the time, but it's really fun in case you want to read like your audio file. So the question then for this one, for Jen, is really about thinking about kind of the incredible lengths sometimes that scientists have to go to collect their data. And Jen had some really good examples of this. So I would love to hear, Jen, kind of your thoughts on the paratrooper beavers and how that relates to some of the incredible lengths folks go to get the data they need.
Sure. One thing, I see some questions coming in about those poor creatures. First of all, something like this would never happen today. We have much more stricter regulations about how we work, in particular with animals, vertebrates, human research, right? Everything is much more restricted than it was back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Even when I started in the early 2000s. So yeah, there would be no parachuting beavers today. I think it's safe to say. But there are all sorts of other really great kind of classic experiments that were really powerful tests of a big theory or big idea in ecology or evolutionary biology. One that I've already mentioned, so Bob Payne, the guy that came up with the idea of Keystone Species, the way he tested the effects of these starfish was every day he would basically walk these trails along the Washington coast, picking up every starfish he found from certain areas and chucking them out into the ocean. Right? He must have had an incredible arm at the end of this experiment. Another really good example, I saw this book, so it won the Penn/E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, right? E.O. Wilson, famous naturalist, one of his big theories was the theory of island biogeography. And that theory predicts how many species you might see in a particular location. And he and his student, a guy named Dan Simberloff, went off to test this theory on these mangrove islands in the Caribbean. And the way they tested this theory was first to basically exterminate the islands. So kill off all the arthropods, all the insects, spiders, critters inhabiting these islands, and then look at how long it took for these species to come back and what number of species eventually came back to these islands of different sizes and different distances off the coast. So imagine, you're the exterminator down in Miami who gets this call from this crazy biologist who wants you to sail off to an island and exterminate everything on an island, right? That also wouldn't happen today, but was a really powerful test of this theory. Even, even work I've done, there's, the little hair clips that older women used to use to keep their pin curlers in their hair. Our lab used to buy out the local beauty store, just buying those clips to make little tiny cages to house caterpillars that would eat our plants in just the right amount. So scientists often come up with creative and sometimes in retrospect, possibly not the best ideas of doing their science.
Thanks, Jen. I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to think about, kind of how the scale of these things sort of evolved over time. So Leah had a question that I want to kind of call back to because I think it is helpful and germane to this part of the conversation. So Goldfarb talked about beavers sort of creating their environment, right? Like kind of being engineers of their own experiences. are there species of plants that you study that sort of do the same thing, that kind of like are engineers of their own environment?
Not the plants that I study, but some of the bacteria that I study. So one of the things I study is a mutualism, so a mutually beneficial relationship between two species, between plants in the legume family. So those are plants like beans or peas, and a special type of bacteria called rhizobia that live in the soil. And rhizobia, I think of them as like the superheroes of the microbial world, because they have this unique power, or somewhat unique power, to take nitrogen from the Earth's atmosphere and turn it into forms that plants can use. So Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, right? But that's all a form that plants can't use. And nitrogen is usually, typically, the most limiting nutrient on Earth, right? It's what plants desperately need, what the insects that eat them desperately need. And so there's this little tiny bacteria that can take that nitrogen in the atmosphere and increase soil nitrogen, increase the nitrogen available to their plants. And so I'd consider that, as cool as a beaver creating these wetlands out of nowhere.
It is very cool, absolutely. So we have time maybe for one quick turn and talk question, one more. So we'll maybe make this a quick one, and then I'll ask everybody to come back, and we'll give Jen some time for your questions. And I'm actually going to kind of pull from another quote that harks back to the introduction of the book, or the foreword, I should say. So a lot of times folks skip the foreword. The foreword came up first in my Kindle this time around, so I read it. In the foreword, Aldo Leopold was mentioned, and he is an author that I have read in the past. He's also a scientist, and he wrote a sort of little treatise in 1949 called The Land Ethic. And I think a lot of what Leopold says, most of his work was in New Mexico, relates to this book and kind of what Goldfarb's goals were. So this is a new quote. This is not one that you would have heard before. So I'll read you the quote, and then I'll kind of repeat the question. So in 1949, Leopold wrote, "It is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for land, and a high regard for its value. By value, of course, I mean something far broader than the mere economic value. I mean value in the philosophical sense." So he's sort of talking about the idea that it's inconceivable to him that in order to have an ethical relationship to land or to the ecological system can exist without love, respect, and admiration for it, and a high regard for its value. And he says very specifically, I mean something far broader than mere economic value. I mean the value in the philosophical sense. And so my question for all of you, kind of the last turn and talk question, is what is the philosophical value of beavers, or of any wildlife for that matter? So if Leopold believes that we should have this sort of philosophical value, what is the philosophical value of beavers, or of sort of any wildlife from that standpoint? So I'll bounce you out into breakout rooms. I'll give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back. It looks like there's a great conversation happening on the chat. Hey, Terra 4, which group were you in before?
I was in 6, and then coming out of a room, I guess I got booted out of the Zoom, so I had to join again.
Yeah, no worries. I'll put you back in 6.
Thank you.
Marcy, were you in a room before?
No, we weren't. We joined late because we're on Central Time and we messed up the time.
No worries. I will move you into room 3.
Great, thank you.
And for Rachel and Glenn and Kimberly, you are all in the same room, so your breakout room friends are missing you. So if you would and have the time and the inclination, jump into your breakout room, we would appreciate it. so that folks aren't lonely. All right. So Jen, what did you think of this quote? So this was one that my stepson is here. He's doing his PhD at the University of New Mexico. And I mentioned that at the beginning of the book, I was reading Aldo Leopold. My stepson studies intercultural communication around ecology and food. And he sent me this land ethic paper that I had not read. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. It's always so fun when you get these things. So philosophical value of beavers. Is it a thing, do you think?
I mean, well, for me,
is it all wildlife?
It is. Yeah. So, I think for me, it's about I value the environment, right? I value the plants and animals that are in it. I value the creeks and the woods and the mountains, and they're my happy place. Like I was just out with my family hiking the other weekend, and one of the kids was in a crappy mood, and I'm like, no, not here. This is this is my happy place.
Sure.
But what I don't know is where I got that value. Like, I grew up in the 70s in suburbia. Like strip malls. Like I have no idea where that value came from.
Well, and when I think about this quote, this idea of the ethical relationship to land, or to the natural world, if you will, has to live through the idea of love, respect, and admiration. Like I use those terms to talk about like my partner. Right? I don't know that I necessarily use them to talk about, I just had to like rehome a cardinal nest the other day, and I was careful, don't get me wrong, but I had that moment where I was like, I don't know that though that level of language is the level that I would use, and maybe we should.
Yeah, I get hung up with the love one. That one's used a little extreme. Like respect, I feel like I can respect it and I can admire it, but I think that's like, well, and I think many of us have this innate excitement about nature. Like nature is cool, and we admire all the amazing things that species have evolved to do. And the respect is I don't know where I got the respect for it, but certainly like in my house, like the kids don't kill something unless they're gonna eat it, and it's well, the love one's harder.
right I think so, but I think that there is also like a sense of of wonder, right? Like I feel humbled often.
That's a great word.
By you know what I mean? Like when I go on a hike, or I like, and just just kind of thinking about how things work. Right? Like that is, I think, the thing that I feel maybe more than love is I feel very humbled by like there's so much we understand and still so much we don't understand.
Yeah, I love the conversations he had with the graduate students in this book. And I can't remember which one it was. I wish I could, but the one who could just sit for hours watching a beaver pond.
Yeah.
And I understand. I would love to do that too.
And I think it does also illustrate just the incredible, again, when we think about the idea of interdisciplinarity, like why it sort of takes all stripes of people to do this work, right? Like, when you think about just the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into doing any kind of science or any kind of research for that matter, that I can spend hours and hours and hours poring over transcripts of conversations that I'm sure that people find completely mundane. And that for me, I'm like, oh, this is so cool what this person said. I think just illustrates, again, how much, whether it's the natural world or the human experience, how much we know and how much we don't know.
Yeah. I remember my mom used to come out and help me do field work in California. And I was working in the California Coast Range. It was kind of rugged. It was, it was these beautiful mountain hillsides. And, she was older at the time, and she'd walk up all the hills in her neighborhood to, get in shape to come out. But, she had always wanted me to be a doctor, right? Like, she's like, a waste of a brain, going to become an ecologist or whatever.
Sure.
And, but I remember one time we were sitting out there and, and I was collecting data and she was writing it down for me. And she's like, Jen, I understand, what you love about this. And
that's a great story.
I don't think it was that she appreciated being out there in nature the same way I did, but I think she could see in me what you were talking about, like that passion to learn about it, right? What people probably see in you about, about the more social science.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. All right, this is a quick one, so I'm going to call everybody back so I have time to ask you questions. Yeah, I think that I also think that it's just fun to see other people get excited about things, right? Like my partner does incredible woodworking work that I don't understand at all, but he's really excited about it. So it's easy for me to get excited about that prop for the most part. There's sometimes not, but but generally speaking, and I think that is like, to me, one of the most exciting things that I can do as a teacher and to some extent as a researcher is to try to transfer my passion to somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I hated science until I was in ninth grade. And I had this great science teacher who, would stand up and do the magic incantation to get our experiments to work, and it was just his love of science that convinced me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's really powerful. All right, folks, we're just waiting for the others to come back. They'll be back in less than 60 seconds, probably more like 30. There we go. All right, just about everybody is back in our main room. Thanks for coming back. I'm always afraid that after those breakouts, we're going to lose some folks. Jen and I had a really fun conversation sort of talking about the idea of Aldo Leopold's concept of the land ethic. Again, this is from 1949. It's inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to land can exist without love, respect, and admiration, and a high regard for its value. By value, I mean something far broader than mere economic value. I mean value in the philosophical sense. And Jen and I talked a lot about the words love, respect, and admiration. And did we feel those things about beavers? Maybe not so much, but that we're talking about the natural world broadly, that certainly books like this kind of generate that perspective. And Jen, you told a really fun story. I'm going to ask you to tell again about inviting your mom to help collect data with you. So maybe we'll talk about that a bit.
Sure. So I think I'm not even sure how we got there. I think we got to, we were talking about our passions and wonder. You used the word wonder.
Yeah, I was saying that I don't know that I feel that if I'm out in the natural world, that I'm feeling appreciative, that I don't necessarily feel that sense of love. But I think what I feel is like, I feel humbled, and I feel that sense of wonder.
Yeah. And that's the way I feel outside. Outside is my, my happy place. I love being out there. I was telling Krista, I don't know how I got that value. I was a 70s kid in suburbia. And so I don't know where it came from, but I just love being there. And I was telling her that when I was in grad school, my mom used to come out and help me do field work in the Coast Range of California. So these really rugged hills, we'd have to drive over these stream beds to get to my field site. She was older, so she trained for months walking up and down the hills in our neighborhood just to get in shape so she could walk up the mountains to where she needed to be. And my mom, like many people's parents, always wanted me to grow up to be a doctor. I heard this for my entire career. Why didn't you become a doctor? And but one day we were sitting out there and she was writing down my data as I read it off to her. And she's like, Jen, I understand now. Like, I understand why you like this. And it wasn't that she felt the same way about being out there, but I think she was looking at me and just seeing how happy I was out there and how passionate about my science and what I was studying, that, she finally got it. And anyway, that's one of my most memorable experiences of fieldwork. That and teaching her how to pee in the woods.
Always a memorable experience for folks. Leah talked a little bit about her group's conversation in the chat, so I thought I'd share that with everybody. She said we talked about the idea of things having value as a very human-centric conversation. Aldo is one of the first in the Western tradition to articulate the idea of animals, nature, plants might have rights of their own rather than of value to humans. And I think that is one of the shifts, kind of even in this space, that Goldfarb is sort of thinking about, right? That there's this sense outside of ourselves that we don't fully understand, but that we know that we're fundamentally affected, even if it's, I was going to use the word downstream again, even if it's far down the chain of how, of how beavers, I have a much better sense of how beavers affect my life day in and day out than I did before I read this book. So we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to open the space for questions for Jen. And we'll use the raise your hand or thumbs up feature again, just to kind of manage conversation, because there's a little bit of a delay there. So if you have a question for Jen, or if you have a comment about this last conversation that you'd like to share, that's not necessarily in the chat, you're welcome to raise your hand.
Am I good to ask my question to Jen?
Sure, go ahead. I'm sorry, Jen, I didn't see that your hand was raised.
So Jen, I was just curious. So you kind of changed your mom's perspective on your fieldwork. Have you had any students that you've changed how they view the landscape?
That's a good question. I think so. So for years I was, so I'm at Indiana University Bloomington now. For years I was at Michigan State University at a really special place called Kellogg Biological Station. And biological stations are just these magical places, which are kind of like camp for science nerds. And so we would have a lot of undergraduate students pass through there taking courses. And for some of them, I can't remember, early on it came up, thinking about landscapes in a city. And in some of our courses, we would have students who had really never been outside, never touched an insect, or scared of bugs and things like that. And being able to teach somewhere like that, where we could actually get students outside and doing science, hands-on experiments where you didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah, we still hear from those students, years later, whether they go on to be scientists or not.
It's a great question, Jen. There's some conversation in the chat, if you've not taken a look at it, about where beavers live in Indiana. Jen, I don't know if you want to comment on that or not.
So at Griffey Lake. So I'm less familiar with Indianapolis. Down here in Bloomington, at the Research and Teaching Preserve run by IU, there's a nice beaver lodge. There's a loop trail. You can see the trees that are either partially cut down. It's amazing. You'll go and you'll see, a tree that just has a little bit more to go, and the next day it will be down. And yeah, it just blows my mind. Anything that can cut down a tree with their teeth is a pretty amazing creature. But yeah, so I see them, around occasionally.
So looks like there's some other places as well. Someone mentioned Eagle Creek Park in Hendricks County. Leah had a question. Do we know if the DNR in Indiana is pro-beaver, or what their management of beavers is? I feel like I knew that at least one time tonight, I would say something that was just slightly questionable. It's a lot of conversation about beavers to not make it slightly questionable. All right, what do we think? What is I don't know how Indiana handles the beaver population.
I don't know. I didn't think to look it up before I joined.
I didn't either. I did a bunch of research. That's not one thing I checked. So bonus points if someone wants to Google quickly. Marcy says that there appears to be an overpopulation near the Indiana dunes. Many trees are down. So kind of opinions or perspectives on sort of overpopulation. And that's one of the things that Goldfarb talks about a lot, right? Is the idea of kind of rehoming beavers as a potential strategy to be able to address that. Go ahead, Leah.
Say, naturally so much of Indiana is actually wetland, or like flatwoods, like wet. And I just think about, I was just looking on the DNR page that you guys linked to, and there's an overabundance of beavers in Indiana. And I just refuse to believe, given that all of Northeast Indiana and all of the Kankakee were natural wetlands, that there's anything like approaching an overabundance of beavers, given what Indiana's native system is. But I think this is a great conversation.
Another question in the chat. Is there a true carrying capacity for beavers, or will they continue to spread out and occupy the available landscape?
So I'd say, pretty much everything has a carrying capacity. So every population has the capacity for exponential growth. So that's the growth that's, ever increasing. But realistically, you rarely see it in nature, because eventually, something becomes limiting. Food becomes limiting. In the case of beavers, that dense enough willow stands will become limiting. Suitable habitat becomes limiting. Yeah, so there's a carrying capacity. The thing I thought it was interesting in the book was this idea of a cultural carrying capacity, which I think is quite different, and that seems more of an artificial construct, and that seems like whatever you make it, right? Whatever you just maybe it depends on the value you put on the beaver. That may have been another questionable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Anne, I saw that you turned on your mic. Do you have a question?
No, I'm twiddling around with the chat, so I'm sorry.
No worries, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right, Jen. I think that the way that a lot.
Oops, where'd it
go? There we go. Thank you. All right. So yeah, I think that that's one of the most important questions. So Rufus added. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So Rufus added some really good information on the chat if you'd like to access it as well. So Mary Teresa, I saw that you put your mic on. Did you have a question to ask? And if not, then I can go ahead and bounce a question from the chat box.
Well, I was just wondering, when we humans think that there's an overpopulation of beavers or whatever else, and they want to pick them up and transport them elsewhere, is that fair to the creature? I know that maybe sounds very juvenile, but who are we to think that we wouldn't want that to happen to us? Pick us up and shift us somewhere because there's too many people in the city. Well, the beaver might have a whole system going on with the other beavers that helps keep the water and the trees and stuff contributing to the earth. I don't know about transporting them elsewhere. I'm uncomfortable with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that that's one of the biggest sort of issues that comes up in the book, and I think that to Marcy's question in the chat also sort of echoes this. Like, do we as a people have a right or obligation to intervene? What kind of what's the right way to go with that? So Jen, do you want to talk about that kind of like stepping back versus intervening as a concept?
Sure. And then I think the other thing that Mary Teresa brought up was you use the word overpopulation, right? Very, very carefully. And I'm wondering how they're defining overpopulation, right? As an ecologist, I would describe it as being above their carrying capacity, unsustainable growth or something like that. But I really doubt that's how they're defining it here in this context. Yeah. So about stepping in, it's a really, yeah, that's a loaded issue because, so many times when we step in, we screw it up, right? I mean, there were a number of cases in this book where, they're removing beavers because they think that's the right thing to do to restore these streams. Or, towards the end, they talk about the guy who uses bulldozers to restore stream channels, right? Is that causing more problems than it solves? It's really hard to tell. And I think some of this goes back to your earlier question, Krista, about the pace of practice outstripping the pace of science. And so for a lot of these, we just don't know. I could imagine that in some cases, translocating beavers could be advantageous, right? The net benefit might be good. Like if it has a higher benefit to an ecosystem over in Illinois than it does, right here in northern Indiana where the beavers aren't doing great anyway, or something like that. but yeah, it's hard to tell. And I would suspect that for most of these decisions, we don't have the data to have a good answer.
And I think that that's one of the hardest things. And I think to that point, I mean, that's sort of where Goldfarb ends the book, right? So one of my favorite quotes from the book, I think I'm going to hang this up on my mirror for the next few days, is pandemonium isn't convenient, but it's often more natural than stability, right? Like that's just something I think I probably need to think about more frequently. And so kind of wrapping up there, I mean, I think that one of the things that Goldfarb does really masterfully is, even though he's clearly sort of pro beaver, I think that he does a really good job of sort of describing what some of the strategies are that we've tried that just probably were well-meaning but didn't work, right? Because we didn't use the science to make those decisions, but instead just said, okay, in the short term, for the next few months, it looks like this helps, right? And so I think that that's a really powerful takeaway from this book. Jen, do you have any kind of final thoughts as we wrap up the evening?
No, I mean, I really love this book. I learned so much. I'm glad, you asked me to be involved, because I don't know that I would have picked it up anyway, but I'm really, glad I did. And I think, for me, I think the way it changed my perception the biggest was this idea of, how do we study ecology? How do we study natural history when we have so little understanding of what was there before? And yeah, for me as an ecologist, that's a pretty disturbing, thought.
Yeah, and I mean, as an evolutionary biologist as well, the idea that story is human constructed, right? Like that, yes, we study the science, and at the end of the day, we make decisions about what's important, what's valuable, what has made a difference, how long the difference should be. So yeah, I 100% agree with you. So I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Jen Lau for being here tonight. There's an applause button at the bottom under reactions if you want to give her one of those. So fun to talk with you, Jen. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. This is super fun. I can't wait to read the book next month.
Great. Yes, we're happy to have you. So for the month of May, we are reading The Butchering Art, and our expert guest is Sarah Halter, who is the executive director of the Indiana Medical History Museum. And it's really a story that is sort of about the science and history of surgery, both in the United States. There's a little bit of abroad there as well. It's a great read. I've already started it. It's really good. Also very poetic, like this one this month. And Sarah's an outstanding speaker, so I think you'll really enjoy it. We meet the last Tuesday of the month. We will be on Zoom again. Stay home and stay safe. Again, huge thank you to Jen Lau, our guest speaker, to Leah Nemayas from Indiana Humanities, Rachel Cochran from the March for Science and Indiana Sciences, and Jenna who's here somewhere from Central Indiana Science Outreach. So happy to have all of you here tonight. And I just can't thank you all enough. I really enjoy being a part of this community. And it's really wonderful to see all your faces like we've seen one another for the past few months, and to welcome new folks to this community. So thanks again to our sponsors. Please don't forget to support our local businesses, and we will see you back here in May. All right, have a good night, everybody. Thank you. Take care. Thanks again, Jen.
Thanks.